Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robert Welch, and in 1958, I presided at the founding of the John Birch Society. From our very beginning, we've sought to accomplish two main goals. The first is to warn the people of the world, and especially the people of the United States, about the existence of a master conspiracy which actively seeks to enslave all mankind. And our second and more enduring goal is to bring about an era of less government, more responsibility, and, with God's help, a better world. We remain fixed on this same dual course today. When we began our effort in the late 1950s, there were relatively few persons who could grasp the importance of our message, for there were very few who even suspected that any real problem existed. Today, however, that situation has changed remarkably. Now there are very few Americans who do not sense that something is vitally wrong in our country and throughout the world. It is not my purpose on this occasion to discuss either the problem facing us or the solution offered by the John Birch Society. Instead, I should leave those tasks to a man who is uniquely qualified to handle them. That man comes to us from Georgia, where he earned a degree as a medical doctor at the age of 22. And from a very good school, incidentally. He then spent several years, or a few years anyway, as a flight surgeon in the United States Navy. While doing advanced work in surgery in 1963, he became interested in and joined the John Birch Society as a local member. Always a leader in every pursuit to which he sets his mind, his ability and determination saw him rise soon to leadership positions in the Society's structure, and in 1967 to membership on our National Council. Several years ago, he gave up his very successful career in medicine to enter the political world. Since 1974, he has repeatedly been elected by the people of the 7th District of Georgia as their representative in the United States Congress. As a longtime member of the Society, of our National Council, and of the United States Congress, he is highly qualified to analyze the problems facing our nation and our civilization today. And his experience as a congressman has confirmed for him the wisdom of our unchanging course for solving those problems, which unchanging course we long ago summarized as follows: education is our total strategy, and truth is our only weapon. Here now to tell you about some serious problems, but also to explain in more detail how they can be solved, is my very good friend, Congressman Lawrence P. McDonald.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Mr. Welch. I'd like to express my appreciation to all of you today who are here in this gathering and who have given up your time and many of the competing areas for your time to come out and to discuss and to review some problems that we face as a nation. I'd like to express my appreciation to those who, through the magic of television and videotape, are also able to join in this presentation. You know, a few days ago, in riding in Georgia with my administrative aide, I mentioned that we would be having this presentation and some of the frustrations that such a presentation brings. Because in the past years, 10 or 15 years ago, in speaking before an audience, it was first necessary to review many of the problems of around the world and what transitions taking place in our land. On such an occasion, it would be for the speaker a foregone conclusion that would have to spend perhaps an hour or so in a rather monotonous, steady review. This was somewhat frustrating because you knew that in advance there would be that hour-long presentation regardless of the audience in instance after instance before you could even get into the area of solutions. But he mentioned that 10 years ago this was perhaps a great problem because you did have to spell out in great detail. 5 years ago, in most audiences, there was greater understanding, but it was still necessary to draw a rather clear diagram. But today, I think more and more people across our land are realizing that we as a people and as a nation have some very serious problems. And there's not a great deal of understanding about what steps might be taken to reverse these problems, but nevertheless, there is an understanding that we as a nation must reverse our present course. So I guess you could say there's the good news that more people are waking up today to the fact that there is a problem. The bad news is that the problem to which they're awakening is much worse today than in times past. We're able to meet tonight in this gathering because a little over 200 years ago, those 56 men came together in Philadelphia to join together in a move for independence because they felt that there were two basic problems in the land. First, that taxes were too high and there were too many controlled by the kings and the king's agents over their day-to-day affairs. And because of these concerns, they were willing to come together in a move for independence, signing that document pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. They kept that pledge, even though some of them made tremendous sacrifices. A number of them were quite wealthy, and they saw their fortunes swept away. Some of them died penniless, in the case of Thomas Jefferson, able to just pay his debts, and others died in great debt. They made that great sacrifice in giving us this new land and new government. A government and a society of which had three major pillars of strength. The first being that of a concept of right and wrong, a legal right and wrong in society that was founded on the principles of a constitutional republic. Coming from the Latin word res publica, meaning the public thing, in this case the law being the Constitution of the United States. It was a unique system of government, and because down through the ages, and certainly today all across the world, most governments, right and wrong is based upon the judgment decisions of men, whether it's the ruling junta or the Politburo or the Star Chamber or the Council of Elders. But our founding fathers knew that historically that form of government traditionally tends to drift over into ultimately total government and then to chaos and anarchy. And they wanted to avoid this in our society. So right and wrong in our system was to be based upon the law and not the judgment decisions of men. And Thomas Jefferson said, to spell this out further, yes, we did produce a near-perfect republic, but will they keep it? Or will they, in the enjoyment of plenty, lose the memory of freedom? Material abundance without character is the surest way to destruction. Rather frightening, you know, when you look around today and you realize that many of our friends are so very busy enjoying the good life. I think we all enjoy the good life, and it's a lot of fun to be able to go out to the lake with a family or to have the picnics or to gather with friends. But I think too many of our friends and neighbors have not been willing to take the time and make the effort to protect the system that allows the good life to be possible. And that was the challenge and the warning that Thomas Jefferson gave us. The second pillar of our strength rests upon a basis or system of prosperity which came to be known as a free enterprise system. I think it gains its strength not because it is a system, but because of the lack of a system. In short, the government was to stay off your back and out of your pockets, or to stay away from the farms, away from the businesses, away from the professions. The government was not to be involved. We've seen a great change in my lifetime, certainly in the 20th century, away from the limitations placed upon our society by a Constitution, and most particularly a Bill of Rights, which were essentially negative documents restricting the growth and activities of government. Today, we find the federal government involved in the professions, telling doctors how to doctor and telling teachers how to teach, and as one wag said, telling carpenters how to carp. But we have seen the tremendous growth in government in the 20th century, an explosive growth far beyond the boundaries imposed by our Constitution. Today, there's hardly a single area of activity in this country or indeed around the world where the United States federal government is not involved. This has produced, of course, an explosive growth in the cost of government. Politicians are reluctant to raise the taxes directly to pay for that explosive growth. This means deficits. And out of the deficits, we have a growing national debt, where today just servicing that debt has become the third largest item in the federal budget. And to further service the debt and the creation of new money, we have had the development of a central banking apparatus, in this case the Federal Reserve System. Now, our founding fathers had a great argument over this point of the question of a central bank, and there's been argument down through the decades on this point. But one thing that is very clear with the development of this, it has become the engine of inflation. Thomas Jefferson, in warning about the question of a federal debt, had this to say: "I place economy among the first and most important virtues, and public debt as the greatest of dangers to be feared. To preserve our independence, we must make our election between economy and liberty, or profusion and servitude. If we run into such debts, we must be taxed in our meat and drinks, in our necessities and comforts, in our labors and our amusements. If we can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of caring for them, they must become happy." I think the emphasis on that has to be that last sentence, that if we can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of caring for them, they must become happy. Now, with this explosive growth of new money, that means, of course, inflation. Now, I know that many people are being led to believe that politicians in Washington during the political season are going to save us from the ravages of inflation. Perhaps if you only remember one thing tonight, I hope you will remember at least this, that politicians do not fear inflation. They love it, because inflation is the mechanism that allows them to expand the currency, to satisfy, to make up the deficits that allow them to pay for the expanding federal program, to satisfy the special interest groups, to guarantee their elections. Politicians do not fear inflation. They love it. It is the mechanism for buying votes, in so many cases, to ensure their re-elections. So many people today have the attitude that inflation is a problem of rising prices. Indeed, we are led to believe that this is the case. And as long as we lack an understanding of basic issues, we will continue to be plagued with problems like inflation. But saying that inflation is like rising prices is just about as foolish as saying that wet streets cause rain. It's the other way around. Inflation is an increase in the money supply. Who causes inflation? Well, two groups. Counterfeiters can cause inflation when they run off pieces of paper in their basement, printing them up, passing them out in society, because by so doing, they steal from society as a whole. Federal government, to make up the deficits, servicing the deficits, and creating new money, whether by direct printing press or bookkeeping entry or borrowing from the capital markets, also is passing out new money without backing. The principle of immorality remains the same. Counterfeiters, we catch them, we put them in jail. In the case of government, we frequently return the politicians to office, praising them as great humanitarians in their process of expanding the money supply. This tremendous growth in inflation, in government, has brought us the deficits and debt exactly that as feared by Thomas Jefferson and many other of our founding fathers, to where today we have the greatest debt in the history of the world, approaching officially $1 trillion. But you know, when you go to the areas of unfunded liability, you're looking at a debt approaching $8 or $9 trillion. If you handle the government accounting in the same way that you would handle in the case of a private business or profession, in the area of promises made but money not in the till, you're looking at a massive debt of 7, 8, or 9 trillions of dollars. The interest on the debt is today the third largest item, as I mentioned, in the national debt, in our national budget, costing us at a rate of over $2,300 per second, 60 seconds to the minute, 60 minutes to the hour, 24 hours a day, 365 and a quarter days a year. You know, just to cover this takes about $60,000 in time just to review the massive importance of the cost to the taxpayers just by that third segment of the budget. With the growth of government, we have seen a strangulation of our productive society with agencies such as EPA, OSHA, and many others, that vast alphabet soup in Washington. We're finding that American productivity is grinding down to the level of stagnation. Competing countries such as West Germany, Switzerland, and Japan are expanding their productive capability per person at a rate of 10, 12% steadily right along. This has meant that in the competitive world of the world markets, that we find that American goods have increasing difficulties. Well, the simple answer that many people propose is the way to solve this, of course, is just simply higher tariffs. But you know, the last time we adopted that philosophy was back during the late 20s, early 30s, and with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Acts. And most economists will agree that the great worldwide depression was linked to the tariff wars of that period. There wasn't anything very good about the last great worldwide depression, and I certainly don't think that many of us would agree that we need another one today. There's been a basic shift in the philosophy of our society and philosophy of government away from the concept of the government's function to protect life and property and over to a concept of government being the agent for the redistribution of income. Today, 60% of the federal budget activity, of the federal government's activity, is that category known as transfer payments. This is where you use the power of government to take money from those who earned it and transfer it over to those who did not. This means that in the process of doing that, we're increasingly penalizing the productive sector and subsidizing the non-productive sector. So that the government's major function today is that of being the leveler of society in the redistribution of income. Now, one thing is very clear in reading the writings of our founding fathers, in writing the Constitution and in adding the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, they did everything they could to make the leveling of society as a function of government unconstitutional. Today, that's 60% of the federal activity. You know, I speak to a lot of high school and student groups. I frequently ask the students in philosophical terms, what is the proper function of the federal government? The typical answer is that government today should provide me with those things that I feel that I need that I cannot provide for myself. Unfortunately, this is not an atypical answer. This is the traditional or typical answer. This has brought about a tremendous change where more and more people are being led to believe, you know, it's a lot easier to vote yourself a living than it is to work for a living. I think the growing welfare rolls reflects the continuing attitude of government's function as a provider rather than a protector. Those functions of government traditionally interpreted as their reason for being in the American system, namely that of protection of life and property, in the area of internal security, that function of the federal government, such as the function against subversives or against terrorists, has been all but totally disbanded. Today, groups in the Congress, such as the House Internal Security Committee, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, the Internal Security Division of the Justice Department, the Subversive Activities Control Board, the Attorney General's list of subversives, and one layer of protection after another have been totally disbanded. Just a few remnants or elements within the FBI or the CIA remain. We find a change in the emphasis upon our armed services, particularly apparent in recent decades. We can look back to the year of 1955 when 55% of our budget went for defense. 10 years later, 1965, 40% of the budget went for defense. 10 years later, 1975, 25% of the budget goes for national defense. Today, about 22 or 21% goes for defense. And yet, in our Constitution, in the preamble, it makes it very clear that it will be the government's function to provide the common defense and to promote the general welfare. By this, they meant a climate by which individuals would have an opportunity to make of themselves that which they would. We today have the verbs reversed. We have the feeling that is somehow to promote a general climate of protection, but to provide for the general welfare. I think many people have it reversed and confused. That section of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, gives the Congress the authority to raise the armies and navies necessary to provide for the common defense. In the United States, we are spending roughly 6% of our gross national product on defense. The Soviet Union, by comparison, is spending roughly 17 to 22%. It's difficult to say exactly, but 17 to 22% on their military effort. It's interesting to compare in history because Nazi Germany, at its height, was able to get up to 15%. Well, I suppose the obvious question is, if Nazi Germany was able to reach 15%, how is it that the Soviets were able to go 17 or 22%? Well, the answer to that, in part, is that the Western institutions, banking institutions, and various lending agencies have transferred money to the Soviet Union and to Eastern Europe to the tune of between 60 and 80 billions of dollars. And in addition to that, there's been a massive transfer of technology, allowing the Soviets to leapfrog much of the early development, research and development testing of new systems, new engineering systems, new electronic systems, and weapon systems. But in my lifetime, we've seen a tremendous shift in the government away from the concept of protection to where the major function today is to provide. Our founding fathers gave us a third pillar of strength for our new nation, and that was a concept of morality based upon a biblical basis or concept, hearkening back to the Ten Commandments of the Old Testament and the teachings of Christ in the New. In other words, this was to be the glue or the matrix that was to hold our society together. Now, as a member of Congress, I can tell you that hardly a week goes by that some member doesn't stand up on the House floor and to shout out that you cannot legislate morality. Of course, if you mean that by legislation automatically people will be good, I would agree. But it's really a trap laid for fools if you stop and realize that all law is morality enacted. The only question is, what is the basis of that morality? We were founded on the concept of a biblical basis of morality upon which our laws were to be based. Going back once again to the Old Testament, Ten Commandments, and the lessons in the New Testament. But in my lifetime, we've seen an increasing shift to a new basis of law and morality, that of humanism. Today, many people are rather confused about humanism because it sounds somewhat like humanitarianism. Humanitarianism is a logical concern about the welfare of your fellow man, a just concern about the problems of your neighbor. But humanism is entirely different. Humanism means kicking God out of the universe and replacing that vacuum created by kicking God out with man and man's technology. And therefore, right and wrong under the humanist is no longer to be based upon any eternal truths or eternal verities, but instead to be based upon whatever seems to benefit man at that time, or man's agency, which is government. This has been the shift in my lifetime. It's very evident, of course, in our textbooks, in our schools, certainly in our entertainment industry, and you would certainly have to say in the laws passed by Congress today. Sad to say, you even sometimes run across some pretty strong passages of humanism in much of the church literature available in many of our churches. Now, I must admit, I'm not much of an advocate or a supporter of Karl Marx, as you probably would imagine. But it was Karl Marx that said that humanism is Marxism and Marxism is humanism. And in that, I would agree. The most malignant form or militant humanism we have seen in the 20th century, that of international communism. But every person here and your friends and neighbors have a very clear responsibility in this changing crisis, the challenge before us, to become actively involved and demonstrate their own personal responsibility. The question is, what is the most efficient and effective way to discharge that responsibility? Lenin passed away in 1924. However, before his death, he laid down a three-step program for world conquest, accurately paraphrased and summarized as: first, we will take Eastern Europe, and second, the masses of Asia, and third, we will encircle the last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We will not have to attack. It will fall like overripe fruit into our hands. Well, principally as a result of the turmoil following World War I and the chaos and some of the changes that took place at that time, old Tsarist Russia was able to fall under communist domination. And what was known as Russia became the first victim of international communism. They were able to spread their control to surrounding areas such as Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Belarus, the Ukraine. And then in the late 1930s were able to expand to the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. As a result of the agreements and some of the wartime aggression, as in the case of eastern and central Poland, and the wartime agreements such as at Yalta and also at Tehran, we have seen the tremendous expansion of that communist empire to now include Eastern and Central Europe. And the first step was completed. Once again, as a result of agreements at Yalta and some of the events that transpired through policies of the United States government, by 1949-1950, we saw mainland China fall to communist hands. And today, even though we have promised that it would be peace with honor, it turned out to be neither peace nor honor, and we are witnessing the greatest genocide, percentage-wise, in the history of the world in Southeast Asia. And we're seeing the mopping up of the final masses of Asia. In the case of the encirclement, we have seen by the 1950s a major Soviet satellite taking place in the Caribbean as a result of United States State Department policies and as a result of the news media, principally the New York Times. It's not quite a joke to say that Castro got his job through the New York Times. But few Americans are aware that the second country in the Western Hemisphere to receive large amounts of Soviet aid has been the country of Peru. Today, between 200 and 300 Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks have been shipped and are now in Peru. Soviet surface-to-air missiles, SAM missiles, Czechoslovakian howitzers, transportation system, and supersonic fighter attack aircraft have all been shipped from the satellite states to the country of Peru. In 1979, we saw the satellite in the Central American area of Nicaragua fall to communist hands under the Sandinistas. We will be lucky if we do not see that process extended very rapidly to El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. In the case of Costa Rica, it was so internally weakened and completely infiltrated by the Sandinista cause that it is in a situation, a nation without any military might. It is in the situation of, frankly, being taken by a phone call whenever they wish to exercise that particular option. These are transitions that are taking place in our lifetimes, taking place in these months, with the possibility in the very near future for tremendous pressure to be brought upon our southern neighbor, Mexico, with the vast potential of a tremendous refugee problem developing as a result of turmoil in Central America extending up into the Mexican area. These are the changes that are taking place. Now, how to change this? Well, we all are anxious to be effective and efficient in this, and the best way as individuals we would have to recognize is by changing policies in Washington, because Washington is the key. But Washington is divided into three separate branches of government: the executive branch of government, the president and his cabinet, and that vast bureaucracy of HUD, of HEW, which has now been divided into a brand new satellite bureaucracy, the FCC, IRS, and so forth, that whole vast alphabet soup. The executive branch agency today makes up 98% of the federal government. Second branch of the federal government, of course, is the judicial branch with the Supreme Court and the federal court structure. In my opinion, no amount of sacrifice by any individual here, your friends and neighbors, of time or treasure is going to be able to change the problems immediately that we now find in the federal judiciary. That is going to be a long, slow process of reversal as we're able to reestablish constitutional law as the basis for legal interpretation and move away from social law as the basis. That will be a battle into the future. In my lifetime, we have seen parties come and parties go in the White House. But all too often, perhaps now by the opportunity of examination in retrospect, we have seen, whether it's Democrat or Republican, at the very top levels, the same forces seem to control in the White House. By default, this brings us down to the third branch of the federal government, legislative branch, divided into the Senate and the House of Representatives. And I think here is the tremendous opportunity in the Congress where we have a chance to make a change. Congress is the key. This is especially true in the House of Representatives, because in the House of Representative elections, those elections are very close to the people and cannot be readily changed or influenced or dominated by the national news media. Much of the media, in the case of an individual congressional district, is divided by small towns and small town media outlets. And here is a chance where, by building an informed electorate and understanding at the grassroots level, people can make a change and have that change felt in Washington. Now, my remarks in this presentation, and indeed my views, are nonpartisan. I think there's enough blame to spread around to all political parties, certainly in my lifetime. And let me add just a footnote here that the John Birch Society is not a political organization, in that it does not endorse or contribute to any party or candidate. In my various congressional races, I've never received a cent from the John Birch Society or an endorsement. But individual members of the John Birch Society you will find to be the best informed and most active in the communities, working for those candidates who are willing to spend their efforts and their energies to develop a reestablishment of our constitutional republic, a sound economy, and a strong national defense once again. The John Birch Society is non-political, but it is active in building understanding at the grassroots level. By way of background, the John Birch Society was founded in 1958 by Mr. Robert Welch, when he invited some 11 or 12 leading Americans to meet with him in Indianapolis to hear him out on a two-day presentation which has since been printed in book form, known as the Blue Book of the John Birch Society. And in this particular presentation, the first 40 pages or so was first a capsule review of the problems we face. And after reviewing the problems, the remaining 140 pages was involved in an effective, efficient, and honorable solution to those problems, based upon the need to build an informed electorate at the grassroots level. You know, Joseph de Maistre said that you get the kind of government you deserve, and I think that's a truism today. He said it in French almost 200 years ago but it applies to America and the problems that we face. We lack an informed electorate. And if you're concerned about the problems and representation that we have in Washington, well, all you have to do is talk to your friends and neighbors and see that lack of understanding. And it is totally illogical to expect to have in Washington a knight riding a white horse and wearing shining armor, slaying dragons in your behalf, if your friends and neighbors don't understand and, frankly, don't care. It's in the living rooms that the battle is going to be won or lost. That might seem strange and it might seem unusual to believe, but it has always been that way. So we can look back in the Old Testament in the 5th chapter of the prophet Isaiah, 13th verse. Here is the prophet lamenting the fact that the people in his lifetime are being led off into captivity because they lack knowledge. And then turning over into the 4th chapter, the 6th verse of the prophet Hosea. And here's the prophet holding his head, wringing his hands in woe because his people being led off into captivity because they lack knowledge. The John Birch Society was founded to build an informed electorate and to reverse that problem. And it has been the most successful organization of its kind in the world. With today over 3,500 chapters, with tens of thousands of members, and an organization unparalleled in the history of the world. I think we're losing because we have a lack of understanding. With that lack, it is tailor-made for many of our representatives in Washington. As one of my colleagues in the Congress, Steve Sims, said, that we are saddled with a lot of people as in the political world who are political transvestites. Now, I know that may be a little bit rough, but what he meant was that many people are able to come back to their districts and speak like a George Wallace and then go back to Washington and vote like a George McGovern, and they get away with it. Now, I, like many of you, have been in the audiences of Rotary clubs or Kiwanis clubs or Chamber of Commerce's. And I've seen representatives come back from Washington or senators come back, and the standard format is that they give maybe 3 good jokes and give phrases suggestive that they support traditional American values, and we stand up and give them standing ovations. And I'll tell you this, many of them laugh their way all the way back to Washington. But as long as we do this on the basis that, well, here's somebody really important, and he came to my group, so therefore if he came to my group, that must mean I am important, so therefore I will stand and honor such an individual. As long as our understanding is on such a shallow basis, we will continue to get those who will vote for more government, more controls, and more spending. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on this point, but I, in my own mind, have always felt that people who are preoccupied with the presidential races are rather shallow in their understanding, or maybe even in some cases just a little bit downright dumb. You know, it's really rather easy once every 4 years to put a bumper sticker on for 2 weeks. I think that's why it's so appealing. It doesn't require any great deal of understanding or commitment. But to those individuals who are willing to take a look in the background of the issues and take a look at the voting and the representation of their representative in the Congress and in their senator, these are the individuals who deserve the great praise, and that requires a lot of hard work, day in and day out, not just at election time. But once again, the Congress is the key. Fortunately today, there are many avenues that are able to improve that activity. The John Birch Society has been able to very successfully form one of those ad hoc committees known as TRIM, with the acronym meaning Tax Reform Immediately. Because with TRIM, here is an organization that on a quarterly basis publishes the key votes of members of the House of Representatives on the issue of where they had an opportunity on a bill that would have been viewed by a classical interpretation of the Constitution as unconstitutional, where the representative had a choice of voting for less taxes and less government, or more taxes and more government. Which way did that representative go? And without making any statement on whether which would be right and which would be wrong, TRIM has been active in publishing the record of the representatives. Today, there are over 300 separate TRIM committees. And as a member of Congress, let me assure you that they are having a devastating impact upon the members. Many members are changing their voting habits because of an active TRIM committee in their district. 5,000 is a minor nuisance when it's just a 5,000 distribution of TRIM bulletins. But when it gets up to 40,000 TRIM bulletins distributed every quarter to the people in that district, letting them know the voting record of their representative, that usually is the dividing point between a representative that gets elected or reelected and one that's going to have to step aside if he's been one of those who's been falling into the political transvestite category. In short, TRIM has been successful at making a division between the rhetoric and the record, stopping the political hypocrisy of those who've been able up till now to get elected saying one thing back home and doing a different thing in Washington, bowing to these special interest groups. Now, in Washington, referring once again to the Congress, let me give you my own subjective analysis of the House of Representatives. Not being in the Senate, I can't give you such a clear analysis of the Senate, but with the House, as you know, it is divided into 435 members. Now, to my own subjective evaluation, I would say that the House is subdivided into 3 separate categories. 2 of the categories are ideological groups. One category is non-ideological. Now, they all look and act like politicians. Whether you're looking or examining on the campaign trail Larry McDonald in Georgia, or Ron Dellums in California, or perhaps once upon a time a Bella Abzug in New York, all 3 will be active in the parades, shaking hands, passing out bubble gum, waving to people, and so forth. You might say, well, why do you do those silly things? The answer is, when you lack an informed electorate, so many of the people demand that you play the game. And many of the people will say, well, so-and-so shook my hand, but someone else did not, and so the one that did not must be a stuffed shirt, and so therefore I'll vote for the person who shook my hand. Now, you may feel that very few people vote on such a shallow basis, but I'm sorry to say that you are sadly mistaken. Many people, since we do not have an adequate level of understanding, many people do indeed base their vote and their support on such a shallow level. So when you're judging individual members of the House of Representatives on the campaign trail, they all look and act the same or quite similar. But when you examine or analyze the voting records of members of the House, it is on this occasion that you find the 3 categories evolve. In my own analysis, one category with about 100 to 110 members is philosophically dedicated to the principles or to the objective of building a totalitarian socialist order. Now, that group is subdivided into those who believe the way to get there is by revolution, violence, destroy the system, and upon the ashes we will erect the perfect totalitarian utopian state. Probably a larger subdivision of this group believes the best way to get there is by gradual change, gradually twisting and perverting the Constitution until someday the people will wake up and realize that they have this system and they're willing to accept it. Whether by revolution or evolution, the objective is the same, a totally controlled society where government will do the planning for the farms, the professions, the schools, and the communities. The central government in Washington will make the individual decisions of the marketplace. Well, there's another group that also is philosophically committed pretty much to the principles of reestablishing limited government as defined in our Constitution. In my own subjective evaluation, I would say that group is perhaps 35 to 40 members strong at the present time. Most members, about 300, fall into a middle category. They are philosophically committed to the principles of, are you ready? Getting reelected. Nothing more, nothing less. And they're guided by a wet finger in the wind. Incidentally, it's not the money involved. Some of you may feel that as a member of Congress, it looks like a magnificent salary, but many members have residences in the Washington area and one in their representative states. But it's not the money involved, in my opinion. I think it's the aura of prestige. Good morning, Mr. Congressman. Let me catch the door for you, Mr. Congressman. This, which is a very heady mixture, a very intoxicating force. And if that sounds strange, the illusion of power, or the concentration of power, has been perhaps one of the most intoxicating forces down through history, certainly in the history of mankind. For the short term, with the building of an informed electorate, it would be possible to re-elect or to elect those who stand firm for sound principles of economics, for sound principles of government, and to rebuild the principles that made this country great and to stop this nation's retreat from our greatness. In time, with the expansion of an informed electorate through an organized effort, I would hope that we would be able to have an overwhelming majority, both in the House and Senate, individuals fully committed to the principles of constitutional government, a sound economy, and a strong security. Now, it's been my pleasure and honor to serve in the advisory boards of a number of different national organizations. In my capacity in the advisory board of the various organizations and as a member of the National Council of the John Birch Society, I've had an opportunity to compare these organizations which have a similar objective but have a different route in fulfilling that objective. The various organizations that I mentioned are essentially structured as an upside-down pyramid, with the members of the organizations, whether it's the American Conservative Union, Conservative Caucus, American Security Council, or others, the member is down at the bottom at the apex. And the national office, usually in Washington, is up at the top across the base. Now, when all is said and done, the basic function of the member at the bottom is to receive mail requesting funds to be sent up to the home office where a particular project is to take place. This fundraising function is usually handled by one of the major mail order or mail out type firms located there in Washington. Now, you might be interested in knowing that the standard fee for handling this service is usually a 60 to 90% takeout of the funds collected. For example, say you have a particular project that is being presented by this organization, a project that you have great interest in, and so you go down to the bank and you take out of your savings $1,000 and you send it to the home office to be able to fulfill that particular project. Well, the standard takeout in the typical contract today is $600 to $900 goes to the group that sent the letter. The remainder goes to the home office of that organization to have a purchase of the stationery, purchase of the stamps, for the salaries of the secretaries, the lease of the buildings, lease of the typewriters, to do whatever work is done there in the nation's capital or on perhaps a nationwide project. Now, in the case of the John Birch Society, it is organized as a traditional pyramid with the apex at the top and the base across the bottom. The apex referring to the headquarters of the John Birch Society, the national leadership in Belmont, Massachusetts, and the base at the bottom, the individual members and chapters of the John Birch Society, the chapters numbering over 3,500, and the tens of thousands of members being coordinated by the paid field staff now numbering over 80. And as an advisor to the various national organizations, let me say that these organizations would love to have that type of coordinated approach at the grassroots level, but they simply do not have the regular monthly bulletin, the individual chapters meeting on a twice-monthly basis, and the field staff to coordinate the activities. But there's another difference. The society raises its own funds, so there is not the 60 to 90% takeout fee that you find so apparent in the other national organizations that in many instances have similar concerns to those of the John Birch Society. But the Society is able to multiply its efforts because it is at the grassroots level that individual members buy the stamps, buy the stationery, use their own pen or pencil or their own typewriter, use their own shoe leather to get petitions signed or be able to have trim bulletins distributed or to have films or film strips shown or audiences gained for speakers in their communities, or for such programs as the promotion of the monthly magazine of the Society, American Opinion, or the weekly publication, Review of the News. These are all of some of the many different programs of the John Birch Society, so active at the grassroots level in building an informed electorate. Now, back a number of years ago, when I first joined the Society, I assumed at that time that understanding the political and economic systems that made this country great would be a very difficult task. But understanding the various political forces making up current events, well, that would be pretty easy to understand and review, because after all, you have the fellows wearing the white hats and those wearing the dark hats, and that's how you tell the difference. But after having the opportunity through the educational program of the Society of being able to do my own reading and seeing the films and film strips and other programs, I have come to see that the various political systems and economic systems that bring about prosperity in a tranquil society, those concepts are relatively easy to grasp. Understanding contemporary affairs, however, is very difficult. But as a member of Congress, I have seen the massive, powerful groups in Washington at work on a daily basis. And I've seen national groups in their writings and in activities and in their memberships and members, such as the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and others, which are working to transfer our national sovereignty into some type of regional government on the road to a global, one-world governmental structure. And as a member of Congress, those actions are very evident in our national trends. Now, you have a very clear responsibility to stand up to reestablish those principles that gave us our greatness. And this is a responsibility that you cannot transfer to your neighbor or to someone else in your family. We can work to try to bring your neighbor and members of your family into better areas of understanding to get them to join with us. But you have an opportunity in the action and educational program of the John Birch Society to take an effective, honorable, and efficient stand to reestablish those principles that made this country great. In the question of whether or not to join such an organization, you have three separate options. The first option is, yes, to go ahead and join the Society and get active. Another option is to postpone the decision and to put it off and to study it in the days or weeks ahead. Or there's a third option, of course, is simply not to be involved and not to be active. But in the process of building an informed electorate, an organized approach is going to be the most effective way for those who are truly concerned and willing to accept the challenge that our civilization and our legacy demands. To those who put off a decision, that usually becomes a decision within itself. But to those of you who feel that perhaps a postponement is the answer, let me ask you, what will you gain tomorrow or next week or next month? Will your position with regard to inflation or the loss of national sovereignty be improved? What will it take? Will you have to wait until you lose a son or a daughter in a no-win war before you decide to become involved? Will you have to wait until your son or daughter comes back from college thoroughly committed to Marxist or humanistic principles? Will you have to wait until your savings or your business is destroyed by governmental decree or by inflation? What will it take for you to be involved? For those who feel that they perhaps can do more by not joining the John Birch Society, be honest with yourself. What have you done up until now? If you took out a blank sheet of paper and were to write down the things that you have done on an active, positive basis to bring about less government, a reestablishment of limited government within our constitutional framework, an active program to reestablish sound economic principles, well, I think most of us would have a blank sheet of paper. Well, I know we paid our taxes and perhaps we avoided traffic tickets, but that's not what we're referring to. We're referring to taking those steps in developing an understanding that will have an impact in our society and have an impact in the legislative halls in Washington. This is the challenge that each and every American faces today. Over 200 years ago, our founding fathers responded to that challenge, pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. They kept that pledge for their time and for future generations. We at this time have an opportunity and indeed an obligation to renew that same pledge for our time and for future generations. In my opinion and my advice, the best way to discharge that responsibility in an effective fashion is by being an active member of the John Birch Society. Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Mr. Welch. I'd like to express my appreciation to all of you today who are here in this gathering and who have given up your time and many of the competing areas for your time to come out and to discuss and to review some problems that we face as a nation. I'd like to express my appreciation to those who, through the magic of television and videotape, are also able to join in this presentation. You know, a few days ago, in riding in Georgia with my administrative aide, I mentioned that we would be having this presentation and some of the frustrations that such a presentation brings. Because in the past years, 10 or 15 years ago, in speaking before an audience, it was first necessary to review many of the problems of around the world and what transitions taking place in our land. On such an occasion, it would be for the speaker a foregone conclusion that would have to spend perhaps an hour or so in a rather monotonous, steady review. This was somewhat frustrating because you knew that in advance there would be that hour-long presentation regardless of the audience in instance after instance before you could even get into the area of solutions. But he mentioned that 10 years ago this was perhaps a great problem because that you did have to spell out in great detail. 5 years ago, in most audiences, there was greater understanding, but it was still necessary to draw a rather clear diagram. But today, I think more and more people across our land are realizing that we as a people and as a nation have some very serious problems. Now, there's not a great deal of understanding about what steps might be taken to reverse these problems, but nevertheless there is an understanding that we as a nation must reverse our present course. So I guess you could say there's the good news that more people are waking up today.
In the Society's structure, and in 1967 to membership on our National Council. Several years ago, he gave up his very successful career in medicine to enter the political world. Since 1974, he has repeatedly been elected by the people of the 7th District of Georgia as their representative in the United States Congress. As a longtime member of the Society, of our National Council, and of the United States Congress, he is highly qualified to analyze the problems facing our nation and our civilization today. and his experience as a congressman has confirmed for him the wisdom of our unchanging course for solving those problems, which unchanging course we long ago summarized as follows: education is our total strategy, and truth is our only weapon. Here now to tell you about some serious problems, but also to explain in more detail how they can be solved, is my very good friend, Congressman Lawrence P. McDonald. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robert Welch, and in 1958, I presided at the founding of the John Birch Society. From our very beginning, we've sought to accomplish two main goals. The first is to warn the people of the world, and especially the people of the United States, about the existence of a master conspiracy which actively seeks to enslave all mankind. And our second and more enduring goal is to bring about an era of less government, more responsibility, and, with God's help, a better world. We remain fixed on this same dual course today. When we began our effort in the late 1950s, there were relatively few persons who could grasp the importance of our message, for there were very few who even suspected that any real problem existed. Today, however, that situation has changed remarkably. Now there are very few Americans who do not sense that something is vitally wrong in our country and throughout the world. It is not my purpose on this occasion to discuss either the problem facing us or the solution offered by the John Birch Society. Instead, I shall leave those tasks to a man who is uniquely qualified to handle them. That man comes to us from Georgia, where he earned a degree as a medical doctor at the age of 22. And from a very good school, incidentally. He then spent several years, or a few years anyway, as a flight surgeon in the United States Navy. While doing advanced work in surgery in 1963, he became interested in and joined the John Birch Society as a local member. Always a leader in every pursuit to which he sets his mind, his ability and determination saw him rise soon to leadership positions